All right, hello again, and welcome everyone to another SciArt live stream. That is some people creating interesting art, and it's sort of like a podcast, but it's better. It's better because you can watch us work on our creative projects while we discuss interesting topics about science, art, or whatever else is really on our mind. And unlike a podcast, if you're watching live, you can contribute to the conversation. We are streaming on Twitter's Periscope as well as YouTube, and you can go to the chat on either one of those services and comment, ask questions, tell us your thoughts. We would love to hear from you. So our topic today is using metaphors to simplify complex topics. Before we get to that, though, I want to let you know that if you want to see the archived recordings of past episodes, or if you want to see the upcoming schedule, you can do all of that and see just more info about the stream on my website at gaiusjaugustus.com/SciArt-livestream. So before we start talking about the topic, I just want to go through and introduce ourselves. We have a very special guest today. I'm so excited. We've been trying to have her on for a while. If you don't know me, I'm Gaius Augustus. I am a visual storyteller and multimedia communicator. And today I am going to be working in Adobe Illustrator, as usual, on a piece that I actually created and drew in Photoshop. And then somewhere along the line, as I was working on it, I decided to switch over and redraw it in Illustrator. And it's just two characters that I created. And I'm just kind of like playing around with cover images for kind of a book cover that I'm playing around with. So, of course, as usual, I am joined by my co-host, Jen. Jen, would you introduce yourself and tell us what you're working on today?
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm a postdoc that likes to draw as stress relief. And inspired by the topic today, I am working on a comic that I came up with a while back. And it's about a graduate student babysitting a little kid, and the little kid wants them to tell a story from their immunology textbook. So the graduate student has to come up with a way to make a signaling pathway interesting to a little kid. So I'm just sketching out the thumbnails right now, and yeah.
Oh, that's really exciting. This is a new project for you, right?
Great project.
Awesome. I cannot wait. So we are also, of course, joined by a guest, and I'm, again, so excited to have Beata with us. Would you mind introducing yourself? Let us know a little bit about what you're working on today.
Sure, yeah. First of all, thank you both for having me. I'm really excited. This is my first live stream. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm Beata. I'm a molecular biologist, and I did my PhD in Vienna, and now I'm doing my first postdoc in San Diego. And, and along my scientific career path, I also create science art and science fashion to communicate science in creative ways. So that's been a whole big adventure for me, and I'm really enjoying it.
And you'll notice today is a little bit different because Beata and Jen are actually in the same place.
Yay!
So unlike our guests usually coming in from wherever they are around the world, these two actually met up. And so that's less tech we have to deal with, but also nice because I get them on the same screen. And so tell us a little bit again about what you're working on today and how it relates to the topic.
Yeah, so as today's topic is metaphor and analogy to communicate science, I want to basically use this drawing that is shared on my screen as an example. So what I want to show with this drawing basically is that using metaphor and analogy is a really powerful way to communicate complex topics in science. So sometimes concepts in biology are really, abstract and hard to imagine. So by taking these concepts and putting them, into a familiar context that people can relate to, it's a really great way to make it more approachable. So the drawing that I'm working on today is showing chromosome segregation. So it's the process where chromosomes are segregated during cell division to make sure that every cell receives the correct set of chromosomes at the end. And the starting point of this drawing was a microscopy image. So I hope you can see it on my screen. Yes, this is a real microscopy image. It's actually really famous. It's taken with a super resolution microscope that received a Nobel Prize. And I think it's really pretty. It shows how chromosomes are being pulled apart. But imagine if you don't know anything about science, if you don't know the context, you might not be able to tell what it is or what's going on. So there's actually, this dynamics going on. The chromosomes are being pulled apart. So the idea is, for me, is the aim for my drawing is to visualize these dynamics by showing that the chromosomes are being pulled apart. So I use this as a template to create a pencil drawing that shows the chromosomes as they are in a microscopy image, and then the mitotic spindle is shown as the ropes, and they're being held by hands and pulled apart to illustrate the process. And today I'm going to be adding colors to this drawing. So this drawing is a pencil drawing I made on paper, and then I went and scanned it, and then I'm going to add colors. So I'm going to first make masks around the structures, and I'm going to add the shading and highlights to make it look similar to the actual microscopy image.
And masking is kind of a complex and advanced tool that a lot of people who actually use Photoshop use. And of course, and the general idea, like you said, is so you can draw on just the parts of the drawing that you want to. So you're just going to be applying color so you're almost like colorizing your pencil sketch. Is that right?
Exactly. And because I didn't draw the structures on the computer doesn't know where the borders of the structures are. So the point is to basically trace the outlines to make the computer know, where the boundaries are between the different objects, and then use these masks to, color and add highlights and shading.
Very cool. So as far as metaphors are concerned, so I followed your art for a long time, and I really love how you're able to take scientific topics and draw really interesting and creative kind of personifications of things. So how did you first start thinking about metaphors?
The first time, actually, I never really had a big plan, but I was always interested in drawing before I started science. But then when I went to science, it's really easy to get drawn in, and I devoted my whole time to working in the lab. But then I had a random opportunity to create my first drawing. It was for a gift for my fellowship organizers, and I drew the theme of my research at that time. And since I had the drawing, I just started putting it on my title slides, on my presentations. And then something amazing happened. So what happened was that people, from conferences, from my institute, could suddenly remember what my research was about, even years after I presented it. Because they remember the drawing, and through this, they remembered my project. So that's the first time I realized that this could be a really great way to communicate science. And since then, I've been making more illustrations and experimenting a little bit more with different ways to visualize complex concepts in science.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think a lot of us, when we first start creating scientific drawings, we're just trying to be as accurate as possible. And I think that one of the things I really liked about your art when I first found it was that you would have, like here, hands. Like, who would think to put hands in a picture with chromosomes? But it really works when you know the topic. And it actually, without any words, you actually can kind of understand what the topic is a little bit, just because you have this great metaphor that you're using.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's the nice thing about it is that both scientists and non-scientists can relate to it. So scientists, they will recognize their favorite process or, shown in a different topic, in a different light. And the non-scientists are able to appreciate it without, feeling intimidated by seeing, the scientific figures and graphs and things like that. So I think it's also a great tool for outreach and education as well.
Yeah, I agree completely. So Jen, how have you viewed metaphors and things in the past? Because I'll be honest, I use metaphors rather sparingly, and part of that is actually because of my field. Because I worked in cancer biology, I don't really feel like it's appropriate to talk about people with metaphors. But basic biology, it's great, and you do a lot of the neuroscience research, which is interesting. And I wonder how you think through like using metaphors and things like that.
Well, I remember one time when I did use a metaphor. I think I was trying to equate, receptor binding. So like, you have a ligand that binds onto a receptor. I was using a lock and a key and I was describing this I was going to give a presentation to a non-scientist science audience, and I was giving it to my I was presenting at the lab meeting. My PI is like, "That's a little corny."
Oh, come on.
But it I guess it just it depends on your audience, right? Like if you're giving when you're talking to like colleagues, if you do use like a metaphor, like a very simple metaphor like the one I described, they'd probably be like, ah. But then I guess it depends on who you're talking to, because I guess it seems like you're simplifying and generalizing something that's a little bit complex. So when you're talking to your colleagues, it seems a little childish. But
when you're deep inside the field, right?
Yeah, you're deep inside the field.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're like, no, you could say the names, you could say the acronyms. Come on now.
Well, and the truth is that scientists, we use metaphors all the time to talk to each other outside of our field. But like somehow, when it's simplified enough that the general public can understand it, sometimes, so then it's off limits, right?
Yeah, but yeah, I have had to use metaphors when I'm talking to like, family members or friends. It helps to distill what I'm talking about so they can get a gist of it. I do feel like I'm losing a lot of like, because then I want to elaborate more. But I found when I start elaborating, they're like, no, that's enough.
Yeah, I feel like the concept of simplifying things is important for this, but also in science, I feel like sometimes you have you hear these presentations, and there's so much data and so much information in there that sometimes the take-home message is hard to remember and distill out of it. So for me, one of the things that I'm learning through making these illustrations, even if it's in a different context, is to really take the essence of a scientific finding or a concept, and then really focus on one main message and bring that across. So that's often what I have to do for my illustrations too, because I can only show one picture.
It's also been thinking about this a little bit, because like when you're talking about it, when you're conversing and using words, it could get a little overwhelming. But if you presented like a picture or something like that, that's probably less overwhelming, because now, I mean, we're visual creatures, so then when we're looking at something, that it is simpler to look at it that way, or easier to look at it that way, rather than like hearing a bunch of words being thrown at you, and that's
right. And actually, if you think about it, a lot of the visuals that we use in science, as far as like diagrams and workflows and things like that, those are technically metaphors, right?
Yeah.
It's a representation of it, like a conclusion from a piece of data, right? So
right.
Except when you look at microscopy images, I guess. But if you look at a lot of the stuff is indirect, right? Yeah.
But used for a lot of functional studies, you're drawing out like molecular diagrams or like interaction plots. I did a lot of genomics, and in genomics we use a lot of like workflows and network analyses and things like that, and it's all a representation of relationships. It's not actually like, it is the data, but it's a representation of the data that our minds can understand. So you've done several covers as well, like journal covers. And do you find that scientists are more open to interesting and kind of creative metaphors when you do that?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I've worked with a lot of different people who ask me to illustrate the findings from a paper, and there's a lot of different approaches and ways of thinking, like everywhere you have it. But especially for covers, I feel like people are very open, and sometimes people have a very clear idea of what they want, and sometimes have really great ideas that is just really fun to then just put it on a paper. But others, they don't tell me anything. They just send me the manuscript and then just want to see what I come up with. Just something that from an angle that I've never looked at it before, because you usually never have to when you just have communicate within the scientific field.
Right.
So there's a lot of different approaches to it. But what I've really enjoyed is when people give me the freedom. It's also a little bit scary. It's a challenge to really come up with metaphors. Sometimes the type of data and type of paper, but yeah, it's always really interesting and exciting.
So what goes through your mind when you first get something and they don't give you any input and you're just saying, okay, how can I explain this?
So what I do is I read the paper. Often it's a completely different scientific field, which is actually great because I get to read literature that I would otherwise probably never read. So I read the paper, I try to understand the background and everything. And then usually what I do is I just, passively, as I go about my day, I think about ways that could kind of connect it. Or sometimes it's, for example, sometimes there's a piece, like in a figure, a piece of scientific data that would where to integrate into a drawing. So sometimes the catch is, just using maybe a microscopy image from the paper, or last time I used, I think, like a high C kind of representation that kind of looks like these pyramids. So I thought it'd be cool to put it into a pyramid landscape, for example. So, and other things are, for example, if they're, for example, using something that is known for something else. For example, one time I illustrated this paper where they used a drug that was used as an arrow poison in Africa. So then the idea was to show this drug as an actual arrow going through the cells. So an interesting piece of background, basically, on the. So there's a lot of different approaches to do it.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I find that when I'm working with people, there's a wide variety of input that I get from them for like infographics and things. And one of the things I love about creating infographics for scientists is really the ability to kind of get outside your field. And I feel like it makes you think a lot more creatively than you can when you're kind of stuck in your own field. I don't know if that's just me.
Definitely. It also has kind of changed for me a little bit the way I think about my own research too. So when I was doing my PhD, I had this project that was I was looking at the dynamics of the structure that is involved in the final step of cell division, but it was kind of a little bit counterintuitive when you think about it, in connection with things that we normally interact with. So then, even for myself, then I started thinking with using these analogies and metaphors to see whether it can help me get some ideas that I can test, things like that. So that's unexpected results that I got from it too.
Yeah, I think one of the first reasons I started drawing for like the science stuff that I did was because I couldn't understand things, and I needed some kind of visual because I started out as an artist and went back to science later, and I was struggling with concepts, and so I had to draw so that I could kind of figure out how things were related to each other, and like what things meant, and how I could just kind of make sense of topics in general.
Didn't you say that was becoming a thing, like more scientists are starting to sketch out a lot of their ideas? Like, I guess, going back to our Inktober conversation, some scientists were doing Inktober to sketch out ideas. So I think it's a good way to go about it.
And I think you and I have more than once had a conversation about kind of the shifting mindset of the scientific community as younger folks kind of get involved and thinking more visually and thinking more about communicating our science outside of just the scientific community, and kind of how that seems to be changing how science communication comes from academia. So I think you're totally right. And yeah, I forgot about that Inktober conversation. That's true then.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there are more than one. There's more ways to communicate other than just manuscripts.
And even like press releases, I hear a lot of people like thinking that the best way to communicate the research is a press release. And then I don't know if that's because they're like, oh, then the journalists pick it up and they'll figure out the best way to communicate it. Which I'm a total believer in letting the people in their field, experts in their field, which are communicators, having them do what they do best. But I do think that that's at the detriment of the scientific community in some ways, because we need to be kind of in control of our message at some level, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We want to make sure it's correct. I know when I was working for the Cancer Center on their communication team, every once in a while, their head writer was like amazing, really talented. But every once in a while, she would come up with a metaphor that was just wrong. And it was no fault of her own. It was just that the scientist had not really explained it in a way that she could understand as well. So she would come up with these metaphors to try and make sense of it to our audience, which was the general public. But sometimes it was just wrong. And it was nice to be there and be able to say, hey, can we adjust this because it's not quite right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that these are the collaborations that I always think are so important. Bring scientists and communicators and artists all together and using each person's expertise to really create really cool ways to excite people about science, right?
Yeah, I also realized that when I work with authors on a drawing, often it's a thing that goes back and forth, and there's a lot of communication. And then it's in the end, it's what I enjoy most is basically how our ideas kind of merge in the final drawing, because everybody has their input, and I think through the collaboration, going back and forth, it just gives a result as well. And it's the same in science. There's so many different methods. You can master all of them.
Mm-hmm.
But working together is what makes valuable.
Yep.
I agree completely. And I think science is changing more for the better as far as that's concerned too, being more interdisciplinary. I feel like it didn't necessarily used to be common for people to think, okay, well, we need to get a bunch of teams together and think about this from a bunch of different angles. And I've been really happy to see how interdisciplinary people are willing to be in their research, even fields that like don't seem to go together, but then they just make it work, and I love it.
Oh yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about like the impact of metaphors. We've talked about it a little bit, but I think, and we've talked about the fact that scientists, we use metaphors in general to talk to other scientists, and of course communicators are often using metaphors to communicate to the general public or non-experts. And I'm curious, Beata, what you think as far as the impact for communicating visually and using these metaphors, both inside and outside the scientific community.
Yeah, so for me personally, I feel like it has two major impacts. One, as you said, is inside, and one outside of the scientific community. For inside the scientific community, we kind of already talked about it a little bit. Practicing the skill, the challenge of getting to the essence of the story and finding out what the main focus will be without getting distracted by a lot of details. Another thing, as I mentioned, was the fact that I get to read so much literature. And what I also realized is more and more labs really would love to have an illustration on the website. And I think that's a great way, to attract people who are creative as well, who are visual, like some of us, and a great way to also have funding for the research. And as for outside the scientific community, I think it's just really amazing to be able to show people, in the form of a drawing, get them excited about something that they might never really have heard about. And I've realized that showing people these metaphors, these analogies while explaining something, they really kind of connect on it on a different level. And I get a lot of really, really good questions about the content and things like that, showing that they really kind of understood it in a way. And so for outreach and education, it's great as well. And to show people how awesome science is, and what we're doing in the lab, and maybe inspire future scientists as well. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, I know. I harp on this a lot about like getting people excited. It's not So we talk a lot about science communication in this sense of getting people to understand science. But I think that you brought up a really important point of, and this is something I talk about all the time, about just getting people excited about science in general. I mean, we get people get PhDs for a reason because this stuff is hard, right? But that doesn't mean you can't be excited about it. You know?
A lot of excitement to really, make the decision to devote a big chunk of your life towards, going into science, and you need a lot of, you just need to stick with it, right? So I think
Right.
that excitement is really important.
Yeah, and I think it's the first kind of step before you get to getting people to really understand it. They have to first want to understand it because they're excited about it.
Yeah.
It's kind of something that I sometimes think we underestimate how important that is.
I guess like after years of being in it, we kind of lose sight of it because it's just like a job. But you're right. I mean, we have to go back and figure out like what actually got us into this whole thing, right?
It's funny. I always use the example when I started grad school. The other grad student in my lab, I don't know why, but he just loves pie. Like it's like the most favorite thing in the world, pie. And we had to very early on have a conversation that I don't like pie, and it was like mind blowing for him that someone could not like pie. And I think that we do that a lot of scientists. We're so excited about science and the new things we're learning about the world and new studies coming out and what's happening in our field that we lose sight of the fact that not everyone is as excited about what we do as we are. And so kind of like backing up a little bit and telling people why they should be excited and giving them some context can be really helpful.
And I'm sure there's, a lot of people who would be excited if they ever, found a way to get in and, found some sort of connection that would, spark curiosity and interest and things like that.
Oh, I totally agree. It's sad how often I hear, non-scientists, the reason they don't really get into it is because it's hard or they're not good at it or some other thing like that. Where it's like that that doesn't have to be the case. It's just kind of like, I don't know, our society, I guess, has told people that it's too hard for them and that they can't understand it and therefore they shouldn't be. So they're just frustrated by it. I don't know.
Even subconsciously.
Yeah.
Happens a lot. Yeah.
I mean, I think this is another topic that we keep talking about in our live stream is what's the purpose of science art? And maybe one thing that science arts can be used for is just like relatability and accessibility. Like since we use these metaphors to distill these complex ideas into a visual graphic, that will help people relate to this very difficult topic. So, I mean, we never really found a real good answer for this question that we keep asking, the purpose of science art, but that's possibly like one way. I don't know. That's how I think about it too.
What do you think about it as far as like the purpose of science art, like how science art in general can improve things or change the world or something?
I think basically the things we discussed. I think one thing, if you're thinking about outside the scientific community, to get a new generation of enthusiastic scientists to help improve medicine and help solve the problems of the world, for example, it's like a kind of a large scale idea that science art and visualization of science in general, I think would be very very valuable for. And yeah, and then I think in terms of within the science community, another thing is that that as we discussed before about communicating between different fields. I think a lot of projects, including actually my PhD project, is that the collaboration between these fields, those people really have to understand each other and want to. It really helps to use these visualizations to kind of quickly get the point across and get people curious about each other's projects and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I know we've talked about this before, but I really think that some of this is kind of the definition of SciArt, which I think was one of our first streams, but that like not all science art is fine art, and all science art is not like super technical drawings. And there's lots of different levels, and they can all serve different purposes as well.
Yeah, it's not one definition. It's not doesn't fit into one small defined box.
There's so many different types and purposes, right? Also, if you think back about on history before, things like that, people had to communicate the research too, and they had to be, the scientists had to be artists as well to, so under the microscope or popularize ideas about evolution, for example. The science art really helped to get it, into the minds of the population as well. Not such an, such an weird combination. It's, I just think it's just the way we do science right now became a little bit of an unconventional thing.
A little sterile, you get.
Right. I am always curious about that transition in our culture because you look at like old anatomy, evolution, all of the research where you're looking at something, microscopy, it all used to be drawings. And now there's kind of this like, actually, I've had really good conversations with people who who do anthropology, and they talk about the cultural sensitivity angle, and that let's say you find some bones, and those bones are from a culture that doesn't want you to take pictures of the bones, but you still want to talk about those findings, and you find an artist who can draw anatomy, and you have them draw the bones. And that way you're respecting the culture, but you're also getting across the scientific principles that you're trying to get across. And I think that there are just so many examples where we could better use science art that we just aren't really thinking about. And part of that might, I guess, be that we're in a modern world.
Yeah.
So people are like, I'll just take a picture of it or something. But
that's a good point.
I know we all know that there's sometimes that the drawing actually does better than a picture as well, right?
I also feel like if you have to draw something, you look at it in a different way. You have to look at the details. You have to decide what you focus on, and you just pay a different kind of attention to it than looking at a photograph or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. So for my job, I look at a lot of medical papers. So these are a lot of times there'll be images where they've like taken a picture of a tumor or taken a picture during surgery of the invasiveness. And if it was a drawing, it would make a lot more sense because I know what I'm looking at, but it's not clear. Whereas if it was a diagram, then what they were trying to say would probably be a lot clearer. Especially if they had an artist come in and do it.
Yeah. Another thing also with drawings, I think you can put the point of attention onto something. You can decide what depending on the point you want to make, what you want to highlight. If you have a picture, of course, really important, and for example, if you think of microscope pictures, but there's so much going on in these pictures sometimes that it's sometimes outside the field or even inside your field to know what the main point is and what to focus on.
Yeah, it's very.
So you have that freedom to direct the people's attention to certain aspects.
I agree completely.
But of course, that is not something that real data is. Definitely, you need all of it, and I think collaboration, also the combination of real data and abstract visualizations and different ways of highlighting different things all together makes it really valuable.
Yeah, so let's talk about that balance actually, because I actually think that that balance can be difficult, especially depending on the audience. Like, how do you, in your work, how do you find the balance between making it understandable through metaphors or abstract elements, but also being scientifically accurate?
Yeah, so that's definitely a challenge, and it's actually a really interesting part, because you can't put everything in. You have to kind of make decisions, and
Mhm.
I think what I generally try to do is I try to keep the scientific aspects as as classical and as I try to visualize it in a way that is represented classically in textbooks and things like that. So to make sure that it's really recognizable for people. So things you might have come across in school or something like that. For example, the mitotic spindle. I try to make sure it is represented in a very classical, conventional way. And then when you combine it with all those abstract elements or elements from a different size scale and things like that, then you can make sure that both elements are recognizable. So I think what I try to do is I try to in terms of the scientific aspects, I try to make sure that scientists or even non-scientists can recognize certain aspects of it, so that you don't have to think too much about it, because there's usually a lot going on in an illustration, right? So the point is to get it at first glimpse.
It's interesting. So a lot of what you do is, I would call it on the fine art side, where these are very. There's not a lot of text around to explain it. It's kind of getting across scientific research in these beautiful images, and a lot of what I've been doing has been more on the side of like infographics, so showing
Mhm.
data or showing off things. And I find the same sort of thing happens there, where you're balancing trying to make something recognizable with trying to also make it easier to understand than technically data is in most cases. I mean, I'm always the type of person who tries to minimize words as well. If I can explain it with an image, I might have the text there explaining it as well, but the image should also do its job to explain. And I find it interesting that there's so many parallels between kind of the more fine art side and what I try and do on the infographic side. Because I think a lot of people, especially a lot of people I've been talking to recently about doing projects, they think of them as very, very different things. But I think that there's a lot of commonalities as far as like um, how we approach talking about scientific topics and trying to explain it in a way that can make sense to people.
Definitely, yeah. And I feel like I was going to say something to this topic.
Thanks, Jeff.
Focus on both. Um, yeah, what I wanted to say is basically also when you talk about SciArt, there's also two directions to approaches, right? There's scientists or people who are trained in science who go into science art, and then people who come from art and go into science. And I
Mm-hmm.
think these two, I feel like the science art that's coming from scientists is probably a little more similar to what you were talking about with infographics and having the details and everything. And science art coming from the art world is a completely different angle, which is also really exciting. But that's one reason why maybe people are not familiar with that idea that science art can also come from scientists. And I guess scientists approach it in a different way. We have probably a different way of thinking, different way of the way we have learned things. So yeah, I think both are really exciting.
I agree completely. I think because I started out as an artist, I think that it's it was very interesting the way that scientists reacted to my work. Um, you know what I mean? But at the same time, I think I see a big difference between how someone who started as an artist kind of portrays topics and how people who are scientists want to portray topics. And I'm not sure if that's just kind kind of a training thing, like how much art background do you have, how much science background do you have, or whether that's more of just the way that you're taught to think in the two different disciplines.
It's probably a combination of everything, and the person, of course, as well. Yeah, but that's the beautiful thing about it. I think supporting something from all kinds of different directions is what makes it really exciting.
I agree completely. So I was going to ask something about something you said. What was it? I can't remember, but I have a separate question. How, which is about that balance again, because how would you find that balance when you're working with a scientist and for a scientific audience? And how would you compare that to trying to find that balance? Again, we're talking about the balance between like a metaphor, abstract element versus being very scientifically accurate. And how do you address that balance when you're talking to a scientific community versus when you're creating something that is more broad?
I think in terms of creating the artwork, usually it depends on the nature of the artwork. I think what is really important to scientists is to have, even if it's just in the background or not in the focus of the image, to have things represented in a very in a way that people from within the feed, for example, can recognize it. So it's like hiding little references that most people wouldn't see, but then the scientists who are from that field, we recognize it and we really appreciate it. So I think as for a question for about what I highlight, what kind of illustrations, I think it's more about what I talk about. I think that, for example, often I use the same image for scientific audiences, non-scientific audiences, but then I just highlight different things, and then all the details, the scientific details that I put in there for the scientific community, people wouldn't even notice very much. And it's also not, it's kind of in the background. So I think it really depends what you want to highlight.
It's like little Easter eggs.
Yeah, Easter eggs. Yeah,
it really is, though. It really is.
Little Easter eggs for scientists. Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny because I always talk about that in my infographic workshops. The idea that the amount of information that you can pack into an image is totally reliant on who the audience is, right? If someone has a lot of background information already in their head, you don't really need to give them the 101 level amount of information. You can give them a higher level, whereas, or I shouldn't say higher, a more advanced level. Whereas if someone doesn't have that background information, then you just have to add a little bit more detail. And that's why audience is so important, right?
Definitely. And every time I make an illustration and talk to people about it, it's always interesting for me to see also which parts how it's received and which parts. Often I get a lot of really interesting feedback on it. So it's also a learning process for the person who illustrates as well.
So the people you work for, do you typically work for people who have hired artists before, or are you typically working for people who this was maybe their first time working with an artist?
I think oftentimes I don't know, I would say. I think even people who worked with artists before, I think a lot of artists work in a very different way. So it might not be comparable. But I think I have the feeling that often it's an adventure for both of us. I think it's also not very often that people work with want to make illustrations. Like often it's for a paper, for a publication. So yeah, so I feel like the main difference basically probably comes more from the personality of the scientists, and it's really interesting to see. Some of them really love the attention to detail, and others really love the completely abstract. So sometimes you find something in the middle, but sometimes it goes more into the abstract area. Sometimes it goes more into the scientific detailed area, depending also on the collaboration.
Totally. Yeah, I found the same thing, that there's a lot of variation between what a scientist might want. I've worked with people who want a very, very like technically driven image, even though it's not really for that purpose. And I've worked with other people that want a very, very abstract, sometimes almost too abstract way of looking at their work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's also always really exciting for me to see, you know, all these different ways of approaching it. Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit. So you also, one of the main ways that I kind of started following you is you also do a lot of fashion stuff,
Mm-hmm.
right? So could you talk a little bit about your fashion and how you started doing that, and maybe even tell us where people can find your stuff?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the fashion thing basically started. I just love colorful clothes, and I just started just doing it for myself. I was doing a lot of microscopy at that time during my PhD, and I just thought the pictures so pretty, but a lot of people never get to see them. You see them at conferences and, you know, within the scientific community, but outside of the lab, I feel like a lot of people never really get to see them. So, you know, I started making them for myself just to just for fun. And then I realized that people really, really loved it, and it really got them excited about science. Like sometimes, you know, when people comment on my clothes, they say, "Oh, nice colors," but then I can tell them, "Oh, this is actually, you know, cells inside of us, and cells are dividing, and this is actually happening." It's kind of getting people excited from a different perspective, and yeah, so that's how it started. And now I had the pleasure to organize some fashion shows, like some scientific
Mm-hmm.
conferences or the science ball, and it's been really fun. And yeah,
Are you still doing that now that um, you're out of your PhD? Are you still doing any of that stuff?
yes, actually way more. So I discovered everything during the PhD, and now
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot, you know, in the break between my postdoc and PhD. But now, even now, I'm trying to. I just love. It's just my. It's just both working in the lab and doing this. I both things that I really love, and I try to dedicate time to both of them. It's kind of challenging. So usually
Mm-hmm.
lab and I work on the art stuff, sometimes illustration. Sometimes I feel like designing a new piece of clothing and things like that. So yeah, I just try to do all of it.
Hey, I am jealous because I wish I could do all of it, but I just like have not been able to figure that out. But
I
I love your work so much.
yeah, so it's a work in progress. But yeah, definitely. I mean, people with a lot of diverse interests, I think um, it often happens that there's just not enough time in the day. And I feel like in the scientific community, I feel like a lot of people have these passions, but because it's so easy to just work in the lab during the day and the night, I used to do that as well.
Here.
Yeah, it's easy to just forget about it, or just you're just so tired, right? But I think
Mm-hmm.
it's really, I think I would like to encourage people to, you know, if they have a passion, so, no matter what type of passion is, to dedicate some time to it. And even for myself, I feel like the transition from working in the lab day and night to working in the lab a lot and also doing the drawings also made my approach to science more balanced. And I'm enjoying it, you know, from a different perspective now as well. So I think there is a lot of scientists who have a lot of, you know, have a lot of interesting talents and hobbies and passions. Um, and it would be a pity to, you know, never get to see that.
So during Inktober, we talked about this, I think, but one of the things that I really encouraged, so the Inktober science thing happened, um, and I got on my Twitter and I actually suggested people like don't worry about the prompts, but just try and like think visually about what you're doing, and just every day try to sketch something, even if it's not, it doesn't have to be good. Just like if you're interested in making your science more visual, just every day take 5 minutes and just kind of try to draw something that represents something in your work. Um, and I really think that that's really an easy way to get started because you're generally comfortable. Most people are generally comfortable with their work.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for people as far as like, you know, they don't necessarily want to be a science artist, but they do want to make their work more visual and things they could just kind of do with their everyday life?
Definitely. I think, you know, trying things out is, of course, I think that makes sense. I know it's sometimes really hard to find the time. For me personally, I have so many, projects in my head that I would like to do just for myself. But the problem is when there's no deadline.
Mhm.
So what has helped me a lot is, I started reaching out to, my institute or, my colleagues in the lab or even, for my own project, and just let them know that you're happy to collaborate with them, and that this is a really great way to, try out things in a kind of pressure environment. But it's, you're doing it not just for yourself, but also for somebody else. So it's, it's, you have a deadline, so it's a thing that really has to get finished.
Mhm.
That really helped me, because it's just so easy to, get lost in all of the work and everything. But I think reaching out, to within your community, to the institute, to your colleagues, and also there's conferences that focus on scientific visualization. This year I went for the first time, and it was an amazing experience. And I realized it's a whole field, and there's so many people approaching this visualization from a different point of view. So, for example, attending a conference like this would be amazing too. So the one I'm talking about is the VISP, the Visualization of Scientific Biological Data. That was an amazing experience too. And yeah, so I think integrating this into, one of your projects is something that might work within, our busy days. Yeah.
No, that's super cool. And I didn't know about that conference, so that's pretty neat that something like that exists. Where was it?
So it's alternating in different places. This year it was in Germany and Heidelberg, but now next year, so it's always kind of in the spring. Next year it's in Los Angeles.
Oh, that's close.
Exactly.
Very cool.
So yeah, that was a really big inspiration for me to, to talk to all those like-minded people, to, be part of a community, to know that you're not alone. Of course, there's a lot of other science artists, but to be, at the same event with all those people was an extremely inspiring thing for me.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I don't think I've had the opportunity to really interact with a lot of other science artists, like in person.
Science art is also about how do you visualize, very complex data that is hard to, just put into one graph.
That's what I thought that was about. It was like more data visualization, but I didn't.
Yeah, so it's all of it. It's part data visualization, part people need tools for scientists to present their data, and then 3D animators who make 3D models of processes in the cell, or science artists. Yeah,
that's super cool. Yeah, I had no idea. This is why we love doing stuff like this, right?
Yeah. Another thing I think that is really fun to start as well is, often there's, these science art shows or science art contests or something like that. Just, to just, even if you have something, even if you think it's not, fancy enough, I think showing it in a context like that is also a really great way to get started. So, for example, I realized that, a while ago, I organized a little art show at a conference. It was a small conference, but we thought we'd just, put it out there, and there's going to be a little art show, like session. And we got some art from different scientists, but then left an open wall for other people to bring their art. And people who come to the conference, they see some of the art, they see that there's an art show, and then the next day they can just bring whatever they want. And it was amazing to see how many amazing pieces of art people brought the next day. So the wall got completely filled with beautiful artwork and of different types. And this is what people just have been doing at home. They just never really, dared to show it or had a chance to show.
Yeah.
And it was
incredible.
People, appreciated each other's work and to get the feel of community. Sorry.
Yeah. You mentioned that that there are art shows and conferences. I know neuroscience has been doing that as well. They have people presenting and selling their art, but also they have like evening sessions where people just present their art as well. So I think, yeah, the science, I have a feeling that scientists are starting to appreciate science art, that they're willing to hold these kind of things in national conferences.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I think Lou always has a booth at SFN. Greg Dunn's always there. Well, the times that I've been there, but yeah. Size is a big.
Exactly.
I always that's something I've been trying to break is name dropping, but
So unfortunately, we're just about out of time.
Oh no!
I know, it goes really fast.
Okay.
So at the end of all of our live streams, we always talk about kind of how far we got. So Jen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I have these like thumbnails that I sketched out, and I got through at least 2 of these.
That's amazing.
So yeah, they're rough sketches, just like portions of the story that I'm going through. But yeah, 2 pages so far.
Awesome.
Yay.
I love
How
it.
long is the final gonna be? Do you know?
You know, I don't know yet. I have the story. The story's like confined. There is an end, there is a middle, and a beginning, but I still have to sketch out the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I was just reading through a few years ago. I have this comic that I always wanted to do, and a few years ago I sketched out the whole thing, and it's like I want to say like 300 pages.
Oh
Like I have the thumbnails all done, and I was just reading it through the other day and being like, this is so bad. And I was like, if I had just done it back then, I would have like the finished. It might be okay, but like the thumbnail, like the flow is not great. And luckily, I can tell what's going on most of the time. But because they're like an inch by 2 inches, they're like super tiny. But make sure you like take a step back, not for 5 years or anything, but take a step back and give it like a few weeks, and then look back at it, and that definitely helps. And make sure you finish it because I want to read it. I love comics, you know that.
Again, just as Beata said,
Yeah.
we have so many projects that we have to do. And so many,
I know.
We have a deadline.
I have someone's expecting me to finish it. All right.
I'm definitely expecting you to finish it. So, Beata, what about you?
So this is what I've done so far. So I have to say I skipped a few parts because the whole process for me usually takes like 40 hours or something like that. So I was trying to skip around between different stages of the process so we get an idea. But yeah, basically this is what it looks like currently. I can show you the final result that I was kind of working towards with this here. I think it showed up. Yeah. So basically I tried to make the colors look similar to the microscopy image. So that was the original image. Is it showing up?
Not yet. No.
Yeah.
Okay. I think my computer is just having some trouble.
We can sort of see a little thumbnail of it.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Oh, here we go.
Here we go.
And then I added the colors. And the good thing about this type of illustration is that even though it's based on a pencil drawing, adding the colors digitally lets you change them afterwards. So you can say orange. So I also made a few different versions. It's really easy to change, and I can never decide what color it will be at the beginning.
Oh, I know. I'm the same way.
So yeah, so that's the way I do it. And then afterwards, if I like it, if there's an opportunity, I just print it on clothes. So for example, the scarf I'm wearing,
Sure.
yeah, I can get it off. Okay, wait, which side? This side. Okay, here we go.
Oh, cool. Yes.
Drawing.
Awesome.
Where's the camera? Here. Yeah. So
very cool.
Just wanted to give you a glimpse of the way I make the drawings.
And you have a shop, right? Where's your shop?
On Etsy. So Etsy.
What's the URL?
The URL I don't know, but you can just search for Beata Science Art. So Beata, my first name, Beata, and then just Science Art. And you can also go to my website. It's also www.beatascienceart.com, and then you can find a link to. Yeah, so it's a tiny shop. I just want to make sure that it's out there, and if I can make anybody happy with it, it's already everything that I wanted to achieve.
Let's post it in the show notes.
Awesome. Yes, we'll make sure it's in the show notes. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I got the line art done. which is sad because that's kind of where I was at the original. But so I got the line art done, and I just started filling in colors. So what I do is I use like a bucket tool to just kind of fill in all the sections. But if the sections are next to each other and they're the same color, sometimes it'll blend them together. So I have to make things that are next to each other different colors. So because I'm not quite sure what I want the colors to be yet, I just kind of picked random colors and went through and just did the base colors. And next, what I'll do is just start masking out areas with lights and shadows um, and try and get it in. But so I don't know if I got. So we always do these. They're always an hour, and we never expect really to get far, right, Jen?
And we also
Because yeah, I'm like a speed. This isn't a speed paint. Like we're working in real time, and like the hardest thing about this is trying to talk and art at the same time, which is incredibly difficult, especially when you're like really interested in what's happening. So I feel okay about how far I got. I think this is probably more than I typically get done. So I'm okay with that.
Perfect. And the fact that you mentioned that you're first putting random colors on all the structures is actually exactly the same thing that I do at the beginning. I just want to, see the boundaries between the masks, and then I add the actual colors. So I like that that we do it the same way. Yeah.
Very cool. So just to remind everyone watching, if you're watching this live, you can watch a replay of this over on Periscope or on my YouTube. Those links will go up in the next few days on my website at gaiusgeodestis.com/SciArt-livestream. And just thank you very much for coming. Beata, thank you so much for finally being on this with us. We really appreciate having you.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
All right, so until next time, bye. Thanks for coming.
Bye.